Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Hines. I am the prevention leader of the University of Bridgeport Safer campus, and in this presentation, we will be discussing domestic violence in Indigenous communities. Within this discussion, we will learn the importance of the month of October, the different types of domestic violence Indigenous communities face, the history of Indigenous communities and the effect, the numbers of male victims, and lastly, methods to end the cycle. There is much importance to the month of October. It's not just Halloween, but more importantly, we celebrate October because it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. During Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we shed light to domestic violence, its victims, and survivors. We spread awareness and resources for individuals to seek help. And on October 10th is a celebration of Indigenous people. Now, there's no coincidence that October 10th falls on Indigenous Celebration Day, because, like other communities, Indigenous communities face the threat of domestic violence as well. The definition of domestic violence is any violent or aggressive behavior within the home, which typically involves two intimate partners. However, there are different types of domestic violence. One type of domestic violence is physical violence. Physical violence is intentional physical force, such as hitting and kicking. Sexual violence, which are sexual acts by violence or coercion. Psychological aggression, verbal acts intended to intimidate or criticize partner. Financial abuse, extorting power and control over partners through finances. Stalking, repeatedly being followed, watched, or harassed. And lastly, digital abuse, threats and intimidation through text or social media apps. According to the Indian Affairs Organization, Indigenous people are 2 times more likely than any other racial minority to experience domestic violence. In order to understand why the rates of domestic violence are much higher in Indigenous communities, we must first look at its history. European colonization occurred in 1492. This was the introduction of unnatural lifeways and conditions into Native culture. Researchers have supported the idea that violence against American Indians directly relate to the historical victimization many endured during colonization. Before colonization occurred, Indigenous women were highly respected and honored, commonly known as sacred beings, and they were believed to have the power of life and death. After colonization occurred in 1492, Indigenous communities lost their culture and cultural beliefs. The status of women downgraded, Indigenous women were labeled as substandard citizens, and the number of sexual assaults against women began to rise. Studies done by Futures Without Violence have concluded that 34% of Native women will be raped in their lifetime. In comparison, 20% of women of all other races and minority groups in general will be raped in their lifetime. Another study done in 2006 by Futures Without Violence found that 96% of American Indian respondents who had been a victim of rape or sexual assault also experienced some other form of abuse as well. Although it may seem that only women experience intimate partner abuse, there are male victims in the Indigenous community as well. We don't hear too many cases of male victims in the media because they do not meet the stereotypical idea that women are the only victims. Male victims go underreported, which leaves room to assume there are any victims who are men. According to an analysis performed by CBC News, Indigenous men make up for 1/3 of intimate partner abuse homicides across all ethnicities.
He's quite social and protective of anybody who needed to be protected.
In Gitneyao, a small Indigenous village 90 minutes northeast of Terrace, BC, the values of family and clan kinships are taught from one generation to the next. As a father and clan leader, Dale Good passed on those values to his son Zachary, an outgoing young man with a love for soccer. He never imagined he would lose him to violence in Terrace.
It took a lot out of our family when this happened. I was at work in Kitimat when his sister and her husband came to my room
On May 16, 2015, Zachary Turner Good was living in the apartment behind me after finally getting away from his abusive girlfriend. On that same day, Isabel Johnny forced her way into the apartment. We don't know exactly what happened next, but a few hours later, Zachary Turner Good died at Mills Memorial Hospital from a stab wound to the chest. He was only 25. Much of the historical experience of Indigenous life in Canada has been shaped by pain. A CBC News investigation found Indigenous men are more likely to be the victims of intimate partner homicide than men in any other ethnic group. Of the cases where we know ethnicity, 1 in 3 male victims were Indigenous. In Zachary's case, Dale knew something was wrong with Isabel as soon as he met her.
Person is cold right off the bat, and there's nothing behind the eyes.
Dale says Zachary was the kind of kid who would try to fix a broken person, and that's probably why he stayed in the relationship. He says, looking back, he missed the signs. Zachary was losing weight, stopped playing soccer, and quit coming to family gatherings. He wishes now he had reached out to his son to talk about those difficult male expectations of manhood.
As men, we have to stay strong and not show emotion.
As a father, Dale has lost a son. As a community, Gitniyao has lost a promising young citizen. As a clan leader within the Gitniyao Nation, Dale hopes his family's story can help other young Indigenous men learn to walk away from violent relationships, to reach out for help. 6 years later, he still talks to Zachary on Facebook.
So my messages to him is that I'm sorry, I love you, and I wish you were here. It's just...
Wabish Hamilton, CBC News, Gitniyao, BC.
This graph reflects the percentages of Indigenous men and how frequent they experience each type of domestic violence. Of Indigenous men, 18.6% experience stalking, 27.5% experience sexual violence, 43.2% experience physical violence, and 73% experience psychological aggression. In comparison, this graph reflects the percentages of Indigenous women and how frequent they experience each type of domestic violence. Of Indigenous women, 48.8% experience stalking, 56.1% experience sexual violence, 55.5% experience physical violence, and 66.4% experience psychological aggression. There are various methods and ways to help end the cycle of abuse and lessen the threat of domestic abuse amongst all communities. One method is to teach qualities and characteristics of a healthy relationship. For example, healthy relationships consist of strong communication and trust. Another way is to involve other genders to become allies in prevention. We can also examine signs of developmental pathways and partner violence, create protective environments for victims, increase financial resources and support, and lastly, provide endless support to survivors through their trauma. In conclusion, we've learned the different facets of domestic violence and why it is important to raise awareness, not just in October, but all year round. The history of Indigenous women and culture. We've learned the significant number of male victims who often go unreported. And lastly, we learned methods to lessen the threat of domestic abuse in all communities. For more information, or if you or someone you know are in need of help, these are a list of local resources. The Center for Family Justice, which is located on 753 Fairfield Avenue in Bridgeport. Campus Security, located on 221 University Ave in Bridgeport. And Health Services, located on 60 Lafayette Street in Bridgeport, Connecticut.